Good afternoon, good morning to those on the West Coast, and thank you for being with us today on International Holocaust Remembrance Day. I'm Melissa Gresh, Executive Director of the AAJLJ, the National Jewish Bar Association, and we are grateful that you chose to spend this hour with us today for Choiceless Choices, Law and the Tragedy of the Lodz Ghetto with Professor Michael Bazyler. Today, of course, is a day of memory, but it's also very much connected to the present. Yesterday, we learned of the return of the last hostage, and while that moment certainly brings us a measure of relief, it also brings us, of course, deep grief and reminds us that Jewish history is not something that exists only in the past. It's something that we are still living through and will likely continue to live through. But remembrance also isn't only about looking back, it's about paying attention. The Holocaust was not just a moral collapse, it was also a legal one. It was carried out through laws, regulations, and institutions that were meant to uphold order and justice. But instead, they were used to strip Jews of rights, dignity, and, of course, life itself. And today, we're also witnessing a vast amount of Holocaust distortion and inversion. The language and imagery of the Holocaust is being weaponized against Jews and against the Jewish state. As lawyers, that should deeply concern us, and no doubt it does. Holocaust inversion is not a form of critique or anti-Zionism, it's a form of erasure, and it undermines both historical truth and the rule of law. Today's program examines one of the most devastating examples of how law was used to enable genocide. The Lodz Ghetto and the impossible choices imposed under legal regime. It is especially meaningful to explore this subject with someone who has been such a close partner and friend to this association and to myself. Professor Michael Bazyler is not only one of the leading scholars in Holocaust law and human rights, he's also a longtime friend and contributor to the AAJLJ. He is someone who has consistently shown up for this community, educating lawyers, students, judges, and helping institutions confront any difficult truths. Professor Bazyler is a professor of law and the 1939 Society Law Scholar in Holocaust Human Rights Studies at Chapman University. His work bridges scholarship and practice and has been cited by courts, relied on by practitioners, and used in classrooms around the world. Some of you might know his book, Holocaust, Genocide, and the Law. You also may know Holocaust Justice, the Battle for Restitution in America's Courts, which chronicles the efforts of survivors and heirs who turned to U.S. courts decades after the war. If you haven't read either of those, I would recommend them. And I know that I learned so much about restitution in law school years ago from Holocaust Justice. What makes Professor Bazyler's work so important is that it never treats the Holocaust as abstract. He insists on rigor, historical, legal, and moral, and reminds us the Holocaust was not inevitable. It was made possible by systems, by choices, and by the abuse of law. We're grateful for Professor Bazyler's continued engagement with the AAJLJ and for his willingness to guide us through one of the most difficult and important subjects lawyers can confront. Professor Bazyler, thank you for being with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Alyssa. Thank you very much for the very nice introduction. I'm very glad to speak to you. I'm also glad that I can commemorate International Holocaust Memorial Day remembrance by speaking and doing a speaking engagement in that particular day. So let me tell you the background of how I came to the subject that I'll be talking about today. As Alyssa mentioned, in 2016, I published a book called Holocaust, Genocide, and Law. It's published by Oxford University Press. And that year, it won the National Jewish Book Award. And chapter one of that book um, was titled The Legal History of the Holocaust. And it's a subject I've been looking at a long time to see how law made the Holocaust possible. And it's something that I wanted to expand into something larger. And right now, I'm finishing up my PhD dissertation on the subject of the legal Holocaust, which is basically that chapter, but expanded into an entire dissertation, which I hope to make a book. And I think I'm saying something different. I think, there's so many books that have been written about the Holocaust, the historiography of the Holocaust, but to look at it from a legal lens, you see just a difference in the story. And it's been really eye-opening for me by looking specifically at particular places that Nazi Germany conquered, whether it's Germany itself, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Soviet Union, how the Holocaust, and I always make this as an example, the Holocaust was not a pogrom. If it was just unbridled violence, it's my belief that the Germans would not have been able to kill 6 million Jews. But the fact that it was done through law made it possible. It was bureaucratic, it was organized, and it was one in which the law also played, and I use this term, as a trickster upon the Jews, because it really served two purposes. One, law made it seem to the perpetrators that everything they were doing was legal, that it was fine. And that was a very important aspect for the perpetrators to know that what they were doing was not just terror, but something that the law, the German legal system, made it legal for them to do. But at the same time, in doing this, I discovered something else. And that's the point of law as a trickster. It deceived the Jews because at every single step, there was some kind of a bureaucratic and legal regime that the Nazis imposed. And it made it seem to the Jews that were under that regime, if we all only follow these rules, we will survive. Right? And no matter how onerous, how corrupt, how inhuman the rules were, there was this belief that we will outlive and will survive. And Jewish history, especially in Europe, was a good guide because this was not, the first time in Europe that Jews were persecuted, and it was done for centuries. And usually there was survival. What the victims did not realize was that's not what the plan was for the Germans. That ultimately there was the goal of what we call the final solution, the extermination of the Jews of Europe and maybe the entire extermination of Jews throughout the world. I always think about that because, there's 12 million of us, not a lot of people. And it just kind of brings me to the present and feeling that, there's always that risk. And just because the Holocaust happened once, that means that it can happen again. And it was done by humans, and it was done through the support of law and lawyers. So the theme of my dissertation basically can be encapsulated in the following phrase: no law, no Holocaust. No lawyers, no Holocaust. And where I found that scenario most prominent and most hurtful and most difficult to write was writing about the Lodz Ghetto. I'll share the story with you. 2 weeks ago, I was in New Orleans for the Convention of Law Professors, and I spent the entire day after the conference had ended to look at this chapter and to finalize it. And I had been cooped up in the hotel for an entire week, going to various seminars that law professors go to. And I was finally going to go and see the town. And it was Friday night, and I thought, good, I'll go see some jazz. And when I finished the chapter, I just felt like I cannot do this. You know, what happened to our ancestors and how horrible it happened. And so I made the spontaneous decision to go to services. And I found Temple, Sinai in New Orleans, and I ended up taking a cab and I had to go to services. So I'm focusing first on a phenomenon of the ghettos. And basically, what the ghettos were, using legal terminology and the terminology that the Germans used, is they were Jewish residential districts, where basically after an urban area was taken over, that particular area was designated as a place for Jews only to live. And from one point of view, it was seen as a positive for the Jews of that particular city because they would be together, they would help each other, they would be in their own community, and they would be stronger together as a result of the heightened anti-Semitism and the work that was going on. But usually what the Germans did is they chose the poorest area of the city. Sometimes the poorest area was where the Jews already had lived. And they ended up taking a much larger Jewish population that could fit into this very small space of the ghetto and say, here you must move. So you have these really terrible scenes of people just pushing as many belongings as they can from one part of the city to another part of the city in order to make the deadline by which they have to live within that particular Jewish residential district. At first, those districts were open districts, meaning that the Jews could leave. In Poland, the very first set of laws mandating that Jews have identification, the Star of David, was promulgated, and later was promulgated in other countries. But the Jews could leave, but they had to identify themselves as Jews. Later on, the ghettos were closed. And one thing that is unique about the Lodz Ghetto, and Lodz is the second largest city in Poland with a very large Jewish population then, an industrial city, kind of like the Manchester of Poland, is that it was hermetically sealed and Jews could not leave, and there was very little smuggling that could be done. And so the Jews lived in that environment for 4 years, and they thought they could survive in those 4 years. They could outlive the Nazis. And unfortunately, they did not because of what Alyssa has referred to and what scholars refer to as choiceless choices. What do you do, in order to survive? What do you do to make the community to survive? Now, the very first ghetto that the Germans established was in September 1939, just a few weeks after they invaded Poland. And it was a small town outside of Lodz called Piotrkowsko Trybunalski. And that ghetto was liquidated, meaning that the residents were, had to forced to go on trains or wagons in places where they were murdered in October 1942. The history of the Lodz Ghetto is different. The Lodz Ghetto was created on February 8th, 1940. So here we are, January 27th, in just a week or so, it'll be the commemoration of the beginning of the Lodz Ghetto. And it lasted for 4 years, 2 more years than the Warsaw Ghetto, the ghettos in other places. And it was lasted for those 4 more years because of the way it was run. And the way it was run was as a dictatorship by one man who basically took the the helm of the ghetto and the residents there, and said, I have a plan. I have a plan for us to survive. That man was Chaim Rumkowski. Rumkowski was a business person, someone not part of the leadership of the Jewish community in Lodz, but because other leaders had fled, he was the one that was still there. And he basically approached the Germans and he said, "We will work for you. We will make ourselves useful." And he told the Jews the same thing. And his phrase was that our liberation, our passport, is our capability to work. And that's what he did. Within the Lodz Ghetto, he created one of the largest industrial enterprises in Nazi-occupied Europe, where workers basically spent time making clothes, making goods, making just a wide variety of items for both the civilians of Germany and for the military. And that was done, as I mentioned, for over 4 years. Now, the ghetto was liberated, or the Germans, sorry, the Soviet Red Army entered Lodz just 4 months later after the ghetto was liquidated in August 1944. And that the Red Army entered on January 19th, just 2 days after they entered Warsaw and they entered Auschwitz. And they found less than 1,000 Jews were still alive then. Some who had hidden, some who kept behind by the Germans to clean up the forced labor. But back in August 1944, the entire ghetto was liquidated, including Rumkowski himself. He himself could not save himself. So he and his family were put on the very last transport. And we really don't know what happened to him. There's various stories that while he was on that transport, the other inhabitants finally ended up, earning revenge on him. Other people say that he ended up in Auschwitz, and then because of his age, he ended up being sent directly to the gas chambers. But we don't know. But we do know that at its peak in May 1940, the ghetto had over 200,000 inhabitants. The vast majority of them, they were deported in several waves to first the Helmno extermination camp, starting in early 1942 through September 1942. And then it stopped, and it resumed again in mid-1944 until the final transport in August 1944. And so the theme I have, and it's kind of like a counterfactual history, had the Soviet troops advanced on Lodz before the major deportation in the summer of 1944, tens of thousands of Jewish residents might have been spared deportations and might have survived. Rumkowski, I think most likely, would have been hailed as a hero for saving so many Jews. And the final deportations between June and August were actually the deadliest deportations, right? By August 1944, when the Soviet armies had already reached the outskirts of Warsaw, approximately still 70,000 Jews had lived in Lodz, and they were only 75 miles away. That's the distance between Lodz and Warsaw. So had the Soviet army not stopped its advance for strategic reasons, political reasons, in January 1945, we can see that a large number of these 70,000 people would certainly have escaped the gas chambers of Auschwitz. Now, the other thing that is unique about the Lodz Ghetto is that it really was a paradigm of a Jewish vassal state that was created by the Nazis. And when I write about this, I focus on the political and the legal and administrative system that was set up by Rumkowski in what many people have called the Jewish kingdom of Lodz, because he really was a dictator. He was 63 years old when he became the leader. He was twice widowed. He was childless, and he ended up in just a few months later marrying the third time, adopting a child, and he presided over an intricate ghetto bureaucracy, consolidating power in the belief that he could negotiate Jewish survival through compliance and the legal decrees that were issued by the occupiers, sent to him, that he had to now enforce in the ghetto, and economic utility. He was convinced that he could preserve a remnant of the ghetto's population. And he ultimately, and this is the really difficult part, that he ultimately sanctioned the deportation of tens of thousands of children, the elderly and the infirm, to the certain death, knowing they would be killed, in order to have the people that were not infirm, they were not old, they were not children, but could contribute to the industrial enterprise that was working for Nazi Germany, that they could stay. Because when the deportations lists were then given to Rumkowski, he had a very difficult decision to make. And if he did not make that decision, then the Germans themselves would have walked in and would have started taking the Jews away. His leadership remains one of the most controversial aspects of Holocaust history, because he viewed himself as a benevolent dictator who wielded near total control over the ghetto's administration. And like other ghettos, the Jewish council that operated inside the ghetto really functioned as a one-person dictatorship. Just think of all the different countries in the world today that are functioning as one-person dictatorship. Well, that was Rumkowski. To illustrate that, during the time at the ghetto, hymns were written about him. Poetry was penned, was written about his wisdom and supposedly great deeds. Stamps with his image and ghetto currency that was worthless outside the ghetto also had his image. And the currency was actually colloquially called rumki, rumkovitz. And it was both a symbol of his authority and the manifestation of the economic vision for self-sufficient economy and money supply within the ghetto. Under his direction, the ghetto became an industrial hub, producing textiles, uniforms, and other wartime necessities for the Reich. At times, employment levels within the ghetto exceeded 90%. Yet, as the ghetto output increased, the inhabitants grew poorer. The wages that they were paid in this ghetto script, in Nurunki, could not keep pace with inflation and hunger that remained pervasive. And with this bureaucracy included all the trappings of a city-state, of a government. So there was an enormous employed ghetto bureaucracy that employed in its government over 10,000 Jews at its peak. It supervised and had a fire department, a police department, a court system with judges, a central prison, various health departments, a welfare bureau for the aged, orphanage that was established, and old age homes, for those that were aged and also for those infirm. An educational system. There was a statistical department, a registration bureau, an archivist department, everything that you would think a city-state or a state that would have. They even had, as I mentioned, its own Jewish police department with over 1,000 men, didn't have weapons, they had rubber clubs. And other ghettos in Poland had some trappings of the state, but none of them extended and created and operated to the same extent as in Lodz. And so what I make the following statement, and I understand that many people would disagree, that the Nazi ghettos, and especially the Lodz Ghetto, became the first nation state of the Jewish people since the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in 70 Common Era. And it predates the establishment of the State of Israel. Now, the ghettos were not independent. They were vassal kingdoms. But nonetheless, they had all the trappings of a nation state, an authoritarian ruler, a presidium of officials who actually were following everything he had, and other department agencies that I mentioned. They were not democracies. It was Rumkowski had a one-man dictatorship to the extent that no other ghetto had. Now, I'm not the first to make this observation. When I started doing this work, I want to give a shout out to Alyssa because she helped me with the research. And she found a book that was written by a Polish historian who lives in Lodz, young man, and it's called The Wire-Bound State. And that's what it was. The author, Adam Satarek, goes through and talks about how it was and had all the trappings of a state. And he begins his book with a diary entry from the chronicler in the Lodz Ghetto describing a visit by Rumkowski from the Lodz Ghetto to see his counterpart, Adam Chernikov, in the Warsaw Ghetto. And the fact that the Germans allowed Rumkowski to travel as a dignitary from one ghetto to another is itself remarkable. And Ringelbaum, in his diary, and he himself did not survive, but the diary did, he says the following, quote, "Today, September 6th, and this is 1941, Rumkowski came from Lodz. He said all kinds of outlandish things about the ghetto. Apparently, there's a Jewish state there," end the quote. And Rumkowski himself will repeatedly make this assertion. And he would say things like, "My ghetto was a little statelet with all the advantages and disadvantages." He even gave himself the title of Prezes, or president, which is the title carried by mayors of Polish cities. So a mayor of a Polish city is called the president of the city, not the mayor. You know? And this is the situation by which the Jews that lived there. It was not precisely a Nazi state, but it resembled that kind of a state. It was an autocracy. Now, there are people looking at this and other historians that disagree with me. So, a historian from Yad Vashem says as follows: "We are confronted with some form of Jewish self-government. But as a matter of fact, this home rule is nothing but a travesty of the term as a result of the misuse and abuse by the Nazis of ideas of Jewish autonomy and territorialism for the purpose of misleading and deceiving." And the last part I agree with. All right. But I think we have to look and see how really it governed, as a state. The tragedy came the second wave of deportations that took place in 1944, where Rumkowski actually gave a speech to the populace. And it goes with this name, infamous name, "Give me your children." And he talks about the fact in his speech, we have a transcript of it, of how he himself, didn't have children, now had an adopted child, but realizing that there was no choice. He didn't use the term choiceless choices that Holocaust historians came up with later on. But I want to stress the point that people have criticized him for the corruption, for the stuff that he did, for all the way that the ghetto was governed. But I think over time, people see, and this is from the point of view of the law, the enormous amount of duress which the Lodz Ghetto was under, and under which he made that faithful choice to save himself, to save his community, and it didn't work. Now, the head of the Warsaw Ghetto, Adam Chernikov, who I mentioned, in that quote by Ringelblum, made a different choice. When he was told that Jews were going to be deported from the Warsaw Ghetto, he took a cyanide pill and killed himself. And so these are choices that had to be made by the leadership of the ghetto. And I want to go ahead and, focus on really the perpetrators here. Because ultimately, we have a situation where it was the German evil that made this possible. And it was this idea, right, that if they go ahead and do everything through orders, decrees that were given and sent to the Jewish leadership, that they would be able to have better control of the Jews. And at the point where they wanted to decide it, the ghettos would be liquidated, and the people would be sent, the inhabitants, to death camps in Auschwitz, in Helmno, in Treblinka, that they would be better organized in order to do so. And then over time, that the Jews would be so, beaten and so exhausted that they really wouldn't fight. And we know that in the Warsaw Ghetto, it was different. That after Unkowski took his life, the youngest, adults decided, no, we're not going to do that. And they went ahead and ended up getting whatever weapons that they did. And you had the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which we all commemorate and celebrate about the bravery of the young men and women who fought longer against the Germans than the entire Polish nation did, or the entire Polish military, when Germany invaded Poland in September 1st, 1939. But I don't want to make judgments. I just want to show you that looking back, the horrid situation that the Jews were faced. And I wanted to remember this on this particular day, because when you move over to the concentration camps, and basically it's moving from one kind of hell of the ghetto to another greater hell in the concentration camps, decisions also were made in which individuals try to survive by cooperating with the Germans. One of the words that came out of World War II, and it's not a word that we use in a positive sense. It is always a word that is used as a pejorative, as an insult. It's calling someone a Jewish capo. And capo was like a slang term in the concentration camps for individuals who then were made leaders, within the concentration camp populations. Jews ending up, because of more food, because better accommodations, were able to save themselves if they did the bidding of the Germans. And after the war, and after the creation of the State of Israel, there were even trials in Israel of the capos. And they came about as a result of a very strange situation where you have survivors, some are more capos, some more the victims, and we're not part of the hierarchy, ending up in Palestine or in Israel, and then running into another inmate that was there. And instead of greeting each other and celebrating the fact that they survived or talking about, what happened to their family members, the victim would end up beating up the couple. And so the state of Israel decided in 1948 to pass a law called the, Jewish collaborators, the Nazi collaborators and Nazi law. And that law, interestingly enough, was used in 1961 in order to try Adolf Eichmann, because it was already in place. Now, you can imagine the Israeli Knesset passing that law. They didn't imagine that there would be Nazis living within their midst, German Nazis, but they knew that they were Jews. And those trials really were a disaster, because when it came before judges, put yourself in the shoes of the Israeli judges and hearing the stories of what individuals did who were capos, or like Rumkowski, who survived, or part of the Judenrat. it was very difficult for them in order to decide, do these people deserve punishment? Or is the entire legal regime that all of us as humans go by really did not exist in what some of the survivors call planet Auschwitz? And on that particular planet, all of the morals that we have on this particular planet did not exist. So let me go ahead and stop here. I can a lot more to say. In my legal Holocaust um, dissertation in the book, I focus on other countries. So I look at, for instance, in France, where the occupation was much different than it was in Poland, and the treatment of the local non-Jewish population, the French, were treated much differently. There were the ethnic or the Catholic Poles. But from places like France, from places like Belgium, from the other countries that the Nazis conquered, we all know that they basically took, cattle cars and moved those people into the ghettos in Poland, in German occupied Poland, and that's if they were lucky. And if they were unlucky, sent to the concentration camps for either selection or to a death camp with no selection. And that's how, through bureaucratic legal means, the Holocaust or the legal Holocaust occurred. Thank you.
Hi, Michael. Thank you so much. As Michael mentioned, I was privileged to work with this a little bit with him. So, fortunately, we were able to find a wire-bound state, which was very good find. So I, if you do have a question, feel free to put this in the chat, put your questions in the chat. Um, so Michael, I guess what I'm wondering, something that we discuss, people talk about Israel really being like the first Jewish state, and that, that it's becoming, it's part of your study is showing that it was not, but obviously this is not a very positive way to show kind of the first Jewish state. Um, what do you, why do you still think it's so important to highlight this to highlight the ghetto as the first kind of Jewish state with in its especially in its legal capacity?
Right. Alyssa, you're asking a very good question and a very profound question. I don't mean to deprecate or to make, you know, the creation of the state of Israel any less important. What I want to do is just take a look and see what was done before that. And from the point of view of us as lawyers, you know, learning about how law operates, how government operates, um, this is what I see. And so I'm just reporting it. So I don't want, my purpose is not to somehow say, oh, it's not, Israel is not the first Jewish state since the destruction of the Second Temple, and therefore Israel is not as important. Okay? It was a vassal state. It was in which the Jews had very little autonomy. They didn't have their own army. They couldn't defend themselves, right? But it was a vassal state. Now, let me make another statement, which is kind of even has this kind of creation. Many times in Jewish history, Jews were living as a vassal state. The state of Judea, King Herod, that was a vassal state. Herod was the king of the Jews, but Herod took orders from the Roman Empire. And we all know that after he died, and there was a revolt in Jerusalem against what the Romans were doing, then the temple was destroyed, the temple that Herod built. So this is unfortunately, the sorry state of the Jewish people. And I think that if I talk about this, what it reminds me, okay, is the precarious existence of any minority that is so small throughout the world. And wherever it lives as a minority, there's a risk of things that we could never imagine happening. And that's my reason for saying that. I don't want to be cute or clever. I just want to point something out.
Do you think that there are, what do you think are the positive, if any, positive teachings or lessons that we can take from what a lot of people felt was them doing their best under an impossible situation, or at least some people felt that way.
Well, I think one of the things we learn is that when you learn that people are killing you, um, and are saying they're going to kill you, take that seriously. Uh, I think it's a warning for us, and it's an important warning. So I think the choices that they made, we now know in hindsight that Rukowski made the wrong choice. Hannah Arendt in Eichmann in Jerusalem, when she talks about the ghettos that were set up in Hungary, in June 1944, when Eichmann came there, and the Hungarian Jewry cooperated, the leadership, not, and he basically, she basically says, no, you should have revolted. You should have told the Jews, run, don't come, and get on those trains. And this revolt could have produced more Jews alive than this compliance to rules, to law. So that's my takeaway from this.
Okay. Jane Feathers asked, under your thesis, wouldn't these shtetls in the Pale of Settlement also meet your definition of nation state?
Sure. It's you're being very good lawyers. Sure. So in other words, one could say, aha, the fictitious shtetl of Anatevka in Fiddle on the Roof, right? That was a city state by itself. Not to this extent. You know, the idea of having its own currency, police department, judges, courts, jails. You know, yes, there was always Jewish self-help and welfare community, producing, helping itself. We did that in Europe. We've done that in the United States. But we didn't create all the trappings and all the necessities, of a state that was created, in those ghettos.
Okay. Um, all right, Michael. This is a very intellectual subject, obviously. And when you finish in whatever form, I'm sure we'll all want to learn more. I know that when we first started discussing this, it was a little bit hard for me to wrap my head around at first. Um, Especially, I guess, in the context of Israel,
Yeah.
current Jewish state. What would you, I still, if you could give me something else in terms of, maybe lessons that Israel could potentially take out of this, if
Uh,
thing.
Look, Alyssa, you're asking a really a difficult question. I
I
mean,
know.
one reaction is this, okay, that sometimes, and I'm not saying this is, I agree with this, but it's something that I think about a lot. That sometimes when the United States tells Israel to do something, Israel should say no. Okay.
Um, that's that's very profound and important for sure. Um, if anybody has a question, also feel free to just take yourselves off mute and ask. because I know that for me, I like to talk to Michael just conversationally. So, if anybody does have a question, just let me know. Um, but if not, something that I did mention to you. Oh, yes, Richard.
Michael, hello. It's so good.
Hi.
It's so good to see you. You've done such great work, and we all appreciate it and applaud it. Thank you,
Well, I
thank
feel
you,
the same
thank you.
about you, Richard. I'm going to break in here. So it's the same way.
Th-
The feelings are
Thank you,
mutual.
thank you, thank you. We'll connect. We'll connect offline. I was just wondering if you could put in context your remarks. Take your remarks and put it in the context of the 1,000-year history of the Jewish people in Poland, as is demonstrated through the Poland Museum, which you've been in, so many times, and you're so very familiar with, and you were so involved in. Because when you walk through that museum, it demonstrates the Jewish people almost as having a state within a state for I won't say decades, I won't even say centuries. They present it as if it's 1,000 years of history. How does that morph into your analysis as it relates to the ghettos during the Nazi occupation era?
Sure. And you're asking, Richard, a profound question that another whole dissertation could be written about. So let me just mention a couple of touch points. Um, Two Polish presidents made the following statement that there is no Jewish history without Poland, and there is no Polish history without the Jews. One of the things that I do in my dissertation, and I do this specifically, I don't call them that I don't I recognize both the Jews and the non-Jews, okay, as Poles. And so I don't call them Polish Jews. I call them Jewish Poles and ethnic Poles. And to me, that's an important distinction. It's also a personal distinction. My dad was born in Warsaw. Um, we, I was born in Uzbekistan, the child of flight survivors. But because my dad kept his Polish citizenship, we were able to move to Poland. And then in 1964, at age 11, we came to the United States. I have my Polish passport. So it's really important for me to recognize that the Jewish presence in Poland was so significant and so important, and I don't want it to go away. I think you probably have the same passion. I know, and you and I had talked about this. So I'm very happy that there is a Poland museum. And the 1,000-year history that you had talked about is a very important history that includes both really bad times and really times where the Jews were really welcomed for economic reasons, for other reasons, but really could build a life and built, the whole Hasidic movement, everything that we find richness, our cuisine, the language we use, the Yiddish, it comes from that part of the world.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to Richard, for being here and for being such an important part of the AAJLJ and doing such great work. Um, so Michael, I had mentioned this to you before, that we had discussed something that you're working on. That's a very important project. If you could just let us know what that
Sure.
is.
And I also want to mention my second shout out to Alyssa, because when I started doing that project, I said, I'm just like a law professor, and it's a new course I'll be teaching. And how relevant is that course to my law students? And I thought Alyssa would be someone that I could trust, someone that could give me good advice as she had on the other one. So I reached out to her. So I am working with the Claims Conference to create a new course called Holocaust Anti-Semitism in the Law. And we presented the outlines of the course in New Orleans. I'd mentioned we had the Conference of Law Professors. And we're going to have call a soft rollout in April and a hard rollout of the materials in June, so that if any one of you wants to teach a course on Holocaust, anti-Semitism, and the law, you will go to the Claims Conference portal that we've created, and you'll find a course in a box. Everything is there. And you decide which units in that course in a box, or which little boxes you want to take in order to teach. And the way the course is structured is it talks about the history of anti-Semitism, focusing on Europe, going back even to the Roman times, but using that as a prelude to what happened between 1933 and 1945. So students today don't think, oh, it just happened in Germany, that the Nuremberg laws were the first set of anti-Jewish laws that existed in European history. They were not. And so I'm very excited about it. And so I mentioned to all of you, go to your law school and say, there's this new course that we could teach as a seminar, as a paper. And if you feel that you're not qualified to do it, I say, no worries. We'll give you everything that you need, including materials, readings, videos that you can use to create your own course on Holocaust, anti-Semitism, and law. And I specifically mentioned the anti-Semitism part because, as we all know, the situation we're in right now throughout the world, including the United States, at least for myself, I never would have imagined we'd be in.
Elisa, I'd like to add something. First of all, Michael, kol hakavod on that. It reminds me of so many conversations we had. But I want to tell everybody, for those of you who don't know, my wife is president of the March of the Living, which every year on Yom HaShoah takes people into Poland and then on to Israel. One year we did a symposium chaired by Alan Dershowitz, Erwin Kotler, and me, called The Nuremberg Laws and the Nuremberg Trials. We took that transcript, went to Michael Bazyler at Loyola Law School, and presented him with this transcript. To make a long story short, he worked with the law review editors. They have a comparative and international law review, and they created a special edition on the Nuremberg laws and the Nuremberg trials, and the seminal documents, supplemented by others, came out of this symposium. I'll end with this. I remember saying, Michael, could we put this law review online? He said, yeah, but nobody ever looks at them. I said, well, what do you get in downloads? He said, well, if we get 100 or 2, we're very happy. Michael, you probably don't know this. I don't think you get the reports. I do. We are now approaching 24,500 downloads from 50 some countries of the Loyola University International and Comparative Law Special Edition on the Nuremberg Laws and the Nuremberg Trials. Kol hakavod to you. Toda.
As This is very meaningful, I'm sure, for you, Michael, and for all of us. You and Richard and everybody on this call is doing such important work. And it's a tough time to be a Jew, in case we didn't know, in case it had been different in the past. But thank you, Michael, for joining us and for continuing to do this work and to be a friend and an important collaborator. We always want to know what you're working on and how we can help and work with you. And thank you again. And to everybody for joining us. and for showing that you want to be with us on this really one of the most important days for our people is extremely meaningful for the AAJLJ and for myself. So thank you to us and for always being involved and for being such a great Jewish family. All right, everybody. Take care. And again, thank you so much, Michael, as always. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.